Hey, Hammy here, back with part 3 of section 2.1, chapter 2.1. In this video we're going to take a look at two of the organic biomolecules that we're going to study here in biology. That is carbohydrates and lipids. The first biomolecule we're going to look at is carbohydrates. Okay, carbohydrates in living things are mainly used for energy purposes. Okay, we need energy to think, we need energy to run, energy to grow, energy to move things through our cells, through our body. Okay, most of that energy is going to come from carbohydrates. Okay, there are some structural purposes that we will look at in a future slide here in just a second. Okay. Again, in the last video we talked about how these big molecules or polymers are made up of smaller subunits. That subunit for carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. Sometimes we refer to these as the simple sugars. The three main ones you'll see are fructose, galactose, and glucose. Okay? Glucose is a very important one we'll talk about a lot in biology class. We do cellular respiration and stuff like that. The formula for glucose I mentioned in the last video is C6H12O6. Okay, so remember, carbs are CHOs, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and you often see them in a 1:2 ratio. Okay, so you notice 6 carbons doubled, 12 hydrogens, and then 6 oxygens. So we often see carbohydrates are in a 1:2 ratio of carbon to hydrogen to oxygen. Okay, up here is your typical formula, structural formula for glucose. Okay, this would be kind of the molecular formula here, and this would be the structural formula where we use lines to represent bonds. Now the thing about this one is at each of these corners here there is a carbon atom. So if you count up all the carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then one up here, 6 carbons. You'd find 12 hydrogens, and then if you count, you'd have 6 oxygens. Okay, be familiar. Okay, so star this. Okay, you kind of have a similar picture of this in your notes. You should be able to recognize this on a test as being glucose. Okay, being a type of monosaccharide or a carbohydrate. Okay. Now also in the last video we talked about putting monomers together to make polymers. Okay, if this monosaccharide, how do we start building bigger carbohydrates? So down here you can see a glucose and a glucose, okay, or a glucose and a fructose. You join them together, remember, through dehydration synthesis. So we took out a water, okay, took out a water molecule, and this oxygen right here is what bonds these two monosaccharides together. Okay, so sucrose here would be an example of a disaccharide. If we keep stringing them together, we get these really big carbohydrates called polysaccharides. And these are some of the main uses in our body. If you look at the examples over here, these go in a similar order as your notes. Okay, for example, number 1 in your notes there's starch. Okay, and here is a monosaccharide, 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 monosaccharide. See how these are all strung together in this big spiral-shaped molecule. Okay, that is a polysaccharide, starch. And we think of starchy foods like potato chips. Okay, potatoes store energy in a carbohydrate as starch. Okay, so starch is the method in plants that they're used for a little longer term storage of that energy in the form of a carbohydrate. Okay, so this would be in plants. In animals, okay, we don't store those carbs as starch, we store them as glycogen. Okay, glycogen is going to be the energy storage in animals. We will break down starch in the potato chips that we eat. The glucose is taken in our blood to our liver, and you can see it's kind of similar. It has these kind of a circular shape, and then it's got these little side branches here, so a little bit different structurally. Okay, and that's how we store energy in our liver. And then as we need energy, okay, these are broken off, released into our blood, and through cellular respiration we can break them down into energy. Third use for polysaccharides is cellulose. Okay, cellulose in plants is used for structural purpose. Okay, so the actual cell walls in plants have this stuff called cellulose, and here you see just long straight chains. Okay, those straight chains give it a very good support. The paper that you're writing your notes on right now is cellulose from plants. In animals, okay, the fourth one, in animals there's a polysaccharide known as chitin, like go fly a chitin. A lot of arthropods, insects that have kind of a shell, when you step on a beetle and it goes crunch, okay, that chitin is used as a structural exoskeleton. So that hard shell around the insect is chitin. When you have to crack crab legs and stuff like that, you're breaking through chitin. So that would be a polysaccharide that has a structural purpose. Okay, now moving on to this would be letter D in your notes, lipids. Okay, lipids are what we know as fats and oils. Okay, where you have some carbs that you can store for a little while. If the body really needs to store carbohydrates for a long time, we call this long-term storage of energy. We're going to do it in the form of fats and oils. That's also used for cell membranes and steroids, and that we'll look at the structure of those here in a little bit as well. In lipids, the monomer, the building block, is what we call a fatty acid. Okay, so here's a typical fatty acid down here. It has a carboxyl group or carboxylic acid. Okay, a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and an OH, an oxygen hydrogen group, hydroxyl group. And then look what you see. Big long chains, what we call a long hydrocarbon chain. Just a carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon bond. Okay, and these things can be really long. Okay, and these are used to build these lipids. One thing that you'll often hear about in lipids is this idea of a saturated fat versus an unsaturated fat. Okay, saturated fats, we say they're saturated because they have all single bonds. We just had a hurricane kind of pass up through Ohio here, and we've had about 5 inches of rain over the weekend, just steady rain, rain, rain. So if you go outside right now, we'd say the ground or my yard is saturated with water, just completely filled. So a saturated fat, if you look over here, saturated fat, it's just all single bond, single bond, single bond, single bond, so that it makes these nice straight chains. Okay, these straight chains let the fatty acids pack really close together, so they have a higher melting point and tend to be solids at room temperature. Okay, so over here, if you look at the saturated foods, coconut oil, which will be solid at room temperature, butter. Okay, a lot of these tend to come from, except for coconut, a lot of these tend to come from animal sources. Bacon grease, my mom used to keep bacon grease in a jar, and it would solidify. After she'd fry bacon, she'd pour it in a jar, and it would solidify, and then she'd take some out to fry eggs or something like that. Oh, good, but maybe not the most healthy. Okay, so animal origins and some plants like coconut oil. Unsaturated fats have some double bonds in them. And so when you're going carbon to carbon to carbon to carbon, it might be carbon double bond and then another carbon. Okay, so if you look over here, mono means one. So if there's one double bond, you see now it puts kind of a kink or bend in that chain. So now they can't pack as close together, so they have a lower melting point, and they tend to be liquid at room temperature. These are mostly from plant sources. EVOO, olive oil, corn oil, avocado, peanut oil, soybean oil, veggie oil. Okay, those oils are all liquids. You also have polyunsaturated that have a lot of double bonds in, and they can really bend back and forth, so you start to get all these bends here from all those double bonds. Okay, these are much healthier for you than the saturated fats over here. Okay, there are 3 examples of fats that I want you to be familiar with. The first one, very similar to what how we were explaining saturated and unsaturated fats, are triglycerides. So just like the prefix tri, like a tricycle has 3 wheels, a triglyceride has 3 fatty acid chains. So here you see 1, 2, 3 fatty acid chains, and they're a glyceride because they're attached to a glycerol molecule, which is 3 carbons over here. And again, how do we connect organic molecules in our cells? Dehydration synthesis. So look, we take off this OH group here and this hydrogen group here. You take HOH out, which is water. Take out a water, and now you see that it's joined together. So we put 3 fatty acids together, so we take out 3 waters over here. Okay, these fats are the fats and the oils that are used as long-term energy storage in plants and animals. If you eat too many carbs, what does your body do? Right, it stores it as fats, and in particular as triglycerides. Can also be used for insulation, like blubber in seals and whales. Sometimes that energy storage is good, like for a bear that would be hibernating over the winter. The second type of fat, and guys, I want you to be able to recognize these on the test, is what we call a phospholipid. Okay, so now this is a lipid with a phospho or phosphate group attached. So instead of that triglycerol, here's your glycerol, the 3 carbons. Now it's just turned up and down now. Here's 2 fatty acid tails. Okay, here's the unsaturated, so that puts a little bend in it. Instead of a 3rd fatty acid, up here we're going to add a phosphate group. Okay, that phosphate group adds, and this makes what we call a hydrophilic head. Okay, because this is the phosphate kind of hogs the electrons, so this is going to be slightly charged here. This is going to love water out here. These are hydrophobic tails, and we'll learn more about this in the cell chapter 2. And when you drop them in water, they make this double-layered membrane right here it goes all around our cells. So plant cells, animal cells, all have this membrane, and even the smaller pieces and parts of the cell have this double-layered phospholipid bilayer membrane. Up here you can see kind of a bigger composite view where we have proteins and sugars and stuff attached to them, and little cholesterols floating around in there. And this would go all the way around our cell. So they're very important phospholipids in making membranes. Finally, the third one we need to talk about are steroids. You may have heard of steroids before. These are chemical messengers used in our body. Instead of sending nerve impulses, it might send these hormones and steroids as messengers from their brain to different parts of our body. The way you can recognize steroid is that they've got 4 rings. So I put some examples here. This is an example of a cholesterol. Notice 4 rings, and then it's got some side chains there. Also over here some steroid hormones, cortisol, testosterone, type of estrogen, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. They all have 4 ring structures, so that makes a steroid very easy to recognize. Okay. So this is the end of this video. We've talked about carbs and what they're used for and types of carbs, and also lipids, their structure, and the 3 types and how they're used in living things. On the next video, now we're going to take a look at the other 2 biomolecules, proteins and nucleic acids.